Joined now from Leeds by Labour's Chris Leslie and here in the studio by the Conservative Priti Patel. Welcome to both of you.
Hello.
Priti Patel, Mr Blair won 3 general elections outright. He's now moved the campaign onto a proper argument about Europe, lifted the campaign out of the endless statistics we've just been talking about. He's got box office style, hasn't he?
Well, look, I mean, I think it says a great deal that the Labour Party have got Tony Blair out today and that their own party leader, Ed Miliband, is nowhere to be seen. You know, it's a sign of desperation. There's no doubt about that.
Or does it worry you?
No, not at all. Not at all. And also what Tony Blair has done today is actually reminded the British country, the nation, the public out there, that the Conservative Party are the only party that's offering a referendum as we go into this general election campaign.
Or is he also reminding the country about the chaos that he says will actually occur if there is a referendum? I mean, he's right about that. There will be chaos, there will be division in the lead up to a vote.
Absolutely not.
Well, there will be division.
Well, look, I mean, a referendum campaign is about going out and campaigning and making the case, you know, for either or. But the point is, we have been clear that Europe is not working. It's not working in Britain's interest in its current form. A referendum is absolutely key. It is right, it is democratic, and it's right that we let the British public have their say on what type of future relationship they want with the European nation, with the European Union. We've also spelt out some of the things that we'd look to renegotiate as well. The Prime Minister's been clear about that when it comes to welfare, getting more control back, obviously stopping migrants from coming to the United Kingdom and having access to welfare and benefits. That is right and proper. And the British public, they want a referendum, but they want more sanity and transparency and balance in that relationship.
And you would campaign for in or out as it stands?
I would campaign for a reformed European Union. I think that's right and proper. Europe is important in terms of trade, we know that. Right. But we need to reform Europe. We have to look at Britain's interests.
So you wouldn't vote in at any price?
We need, quite rightly, as we have with David Cameron, a Prime Minister that's going to stand up for Britain in Europe, and that's exactly the path that he's advocating.
Chris Leslie, are you pleased that Tony Blair has entered the campaign at this stage on the issue of a European referendum?
Absolutely, and I think he comes with a perspective. One, as a former Prime Minister, he knows how all-consuming it can be to renegotiate what could be one of the most important things for Britain's economy. He, I think, in his speech quite rightly sets out how David Cameron, if he were Prime Minister for the next few years, would end up being absolutely dominated by, you know, renegotiations with dozens and dozens of other leaders across Europe, and ultimately taking his eye off the ball, not just of our own economic prospects, but also our public services as well.
But
we know he doesn't particularly keep his eye on the ball of the NHS and what's happening in public services, but I think it would be a folly for him to have that political distraction at a time when we should be rebuilding an economy that shares prosperity amongst everybody.
Or does he just remind the public that you, Labour, are not going to give the public a vote? Why don't you trust the people?
Well, I don't think that's the issue. I think we've said if there is a change of sovereignty, if there is a further treaty that does move powers to Europe, then that would be the point at which you'd have that in-out referendum. But that's not on the cards. And actually, you know, most of the voters that I meet are particularly focused on living standards and how we can make sure we get a recovery that everybody has a stake in. The only way of doing that is, I think, also listening to what the business community are saying. They are absolutely aghast at David Cameron, as a Prime Minister, actually potentially closing markets for our exporters rather than opening new markets. That's what Prime Ministers ought to be doing. Well, and it's all because of the need to placate people like Priti, actually, all this sort of rampant Eurosceptics that we have on the right wing of the Conservative Party, and of course some in the media as well. So it's just for political games David Cameron's gone down this road.
I'll let Priti Patel answer the fact that rampant Eurosceptics on the right of the party. But isn't it true? I mean, David Cameron has appealed to supporters of UKIP to come home to the Conservatives. That was the only reason he offered a referendum, was to stem the flow of Tory supporters to UKIP, because he was scared.
That's nothing to do with it at all. I think it is a fact.
Why is he asking them to come home?
Well, it is a reality now. I mean, they're asking them to come home because if they vote any other way now, whether it's for UKIP, all they'll do is they'll let Ed Miliband into number 10, and then we won't get a referendum.
But that's why he promised a referendum.
And the point is, we are the only party offering a referendum right now to give that clear choice. And the fact is that Europe isn't working.
UKIP are offering a referendum.
Europe is not working for Britain right now. We have to renegotiate renegotiate our relationship, bring back sanity and bring back balance and put Britain first. That is absolutely vital. I think it's quite ironic today as well that Labour have got Tony Blair out. Tony Blair was the man that signed us up to the Lisbon Treaty, gave away sovereignty, more powers, never fought.
And what happened to David Cameron's cast iron guarantee regarding the Lisbon Treaty?
The fact
He broke it.
The fact is, as a coalition government, we could not deliver that in a coalition government.
What
So
was
that is
I
widely known to the public. We are campaigning now for a Conservative majority government that will deliver a referendum, which is why we're saying to the British public, if you want that referendum, vote Conservative. We're the only political party out there that'll give you that
And would you share that platform, if you don't have the numbers, with UKIP, who also share the idea for a referendum?
We're not into sharing platforms. I've already said, Joe, we are campaigning for a Conservative majority government.
Yeah, Chris Leslie, you were trying to come in there.
Well, I think if you want to know how successful David Cameron is at negotiation, just look at his great triumph in stopping Jean-Claude Juncker as the president of the of the European Commission. I think he was outvoted, 26 votes to 2 in that circumstance. Yes, of course we've got to have reform in Europe, but that actually means engaging, making sure that we have that agenda for the budget to be properly spent on things to do with economic regeneration, not this sort of political game playing, which is totally about trying to keep the Conservative Party together. But you could see the true bedfellows of the Tories with his appeal to UKIP today. UKIP are, of course, more Tory than the Tories themselves.
But you've said that business leaders are aghast at David Cameron's leadership over Europe. But the business leaders and the quotes from those business leaders that you included in your advert last week didn't want to be signed up to the Labour Party. They may not want a referendum over Europe because they think it'll bring uncertainty, but they wanted to distance themselves from you.
Well, I don't think that there was ever an attempt to say that they were Labour or Conservative.
Oh, Chris Leslie, if you include them in a Labour Party advert in a national newspaper, then the idea is that they're aligning with Labour.
No, we were focusing on this question of Europe, and ultimately Britain's place in the European Union should be one of leadership rather than exit. It's our, I think, long-term best interests to make sure that we're actually steering the European Union, not being steered by it. If we left the European Union in the way that Priti and David Cameron might risk happening, then we'd still end up having to jump to the tune of many of the directives and things that happen to be made by the European Union. It's just that we wouldn't have any seat around the table in the way that Tony Blair points out with some of the Scandinavian countries.
Well, it's a shame then that business isn't giving you much of a hearing, bearing in mind you say they're so signed up to your policy when it comes to Europe. 103 business leaders signed a letter warning a Labour government would threaten jobs and deter investment.
No, I mean, I think, we could go through the business of trading various business names and supporters, but ultimately...
You won't have 103, I don't think.
Well, I think, look, if you want me to list them all now,
no.
we could go, but ultimately,
we'll
I think that
business
really do care about export markets. They want our economy to succeed, and our prosperity does depend on making sure that they can export to all those other markets and influence the shape of that market. So that place of Britain in the European Union is very, very important, and I think it's right that we focus on it.
Will Ed Miliband be sharing a platform with Tony Blair during the campaign?
I hope so. I mean, I think it was good that Tony... I don't know. We've got a long way. What are we, 4.5 weeks, a bit more than that to go? So, but I think Tony Blair has done the right thing today to talk about the clear and present danger to our economic prosperity that Priti and David Cameron would risk by playing political games with what should be our economic future.
Right, you have the last
word. This is not about political gain at all. This is about the future of our country, and it's about Britain's security, both when it comes to our relationship with the European Union, Chris, when it comes to the European Union, but also our place in the world. Chris mentioned leadership. The only political leader out there is David Cameron that's offering a clear choice at the election between competence and chaos, as we know with Labour. Labour can't even offer good leadership right now. I mean, where is the Labour leader today? They've got Tony Blair out on the stump rather than their own leader. But this is about having the democratic say through a referendum, and that is right and proper. And it's right that in a Conservative government, we will reform Europe and we will renegotiate our relationship.
Damien Bride, does he bring a bit of stardust, Tony Blair, to the campaign?
He does, and I think he brings something else. He brings that sort of credibility for Ed Miliband. For him to stand up there and what's indisputable, whichever side of the political debate you're on, is that Ed Miliband has shown considerable backbone in resisting the calls from within a party, from some of the trade union movement.
On this issue, aren't they?
Yes, very much so. To call a referendum, and he's rejected and resisted those. I didn't expect him to. I expected him to have folded by now, but he has shown that backbone. And I think for Tony Blair to come out and say that is a strengthening thing.
Will
for him.
Team Miliband be cheering his intervention?
I think they will. I think they'll be cheering another one. If he comes out and says how difficult it is once you announce that you're standing down at some future stage as a Prime Minister, how difficult it becomes to do business on the international stage. That wasn't at the centre of his argument today, Tony Blair, but it's certainly true that David Cameron will find it incredibly difficult to succeed in any kind of renegotiation now that the clock's ticking on his premiership.
All right, Priti Patel. Chris Leslie, thank you.
Thank you. But stay where you are, particularly Chris Leslie, because we're going to talk about health, but you too, Priti Patel, because remember this. That's the Tories' famous election billboard. It was used in the run-up to the 1979 general election to beat Jim Callaghan's Labour government, took Mrs Thatcher to power. Doesn't it look incredibly similar to this? It's a billboard. Labour have released today, modelled on that famous Labour Isn't Working campaign from 1979. There it is. The poster features the same long line of people used to illustrate dole queues in 79. This time places them outside a GP's waiting room. Labour's accusing the Tories of making it harder to see a GP as they attempt to put the NHS back at the centre of the election campaign. Chris, let me come to you, Chris Leslie. You say that that people are having to wait longer to see GPs and to see GPs out of hours, but the figures you use stop in March of 2014. Why did you not include the figures after 2014, which saw an extra 1,100 practices open out of hours?
Well, we've used the most available data, most recently available data for
these
the
figures
whole
are
of the
available
country.
now.
What Jeremy Hunt has tried to do is say, oh, well, since that data set was available, we've been putting in money in certain areas, but only in a minority of GP practices and in a minority of communities, not across the country as a whole. And I think most people know from their own experience when they try and get an appointment, a routine appointment from the GP, that it is increasingly difficult. That 48-hour goal has been dropped, and in fact I think the statistics show that there are 600 practices which fewer are offering those out-of-hours services weekends and evenings than was the case back in 2010.
These figures are not mysterious. I mean, these are on the record. The Prime Minister's Challenge Fund was introduced in April of 2014. It covers 1,100 practices. It helps 7.5 million patients. There's another 100 million in the pipeline to extend this to 1,400 additional practices, helping 10 million extra people. Why didn't your figures take any of that into account?
Because we use the most recently available statistics for the whole of the country.
Why have I got these figures and you don't?
And what you're looking at are the Jeremy Hunt sort of promises and pledges and forecasts for what he intends to do, because he knows he was in a hole with what was happening with GP.
The first part is not a promise. The first part has happened. The first part covers 1,100 practices. Well, has been doing so since April of last year.
Look, we can talk about the statistics set and the data set.
Well, you raised the statistics. Yeah, that's why I'm going at them.
And my understanding is, I'll repeat it again, is that we're using the most recent available data set for the whole of the country, and we're not just going to take Jeremy Hunt's word for it. What he's doing, sort of, as his feet rapidly move to try and dig himself out of the hole subsequent to that. Now, we have got a problem with access to GPs. I find it when I talk to some of my GPs in Nottingham. We see it all the time. A lot of people now are even, having to ring up, and when they don't get that appointment, they say, well, they'll just turn up at 8 o'clock, and as though it's just an emergency, and that's just going to make the system get even more overwhelmed. People going to A&E and clogging up the A&E system. We can't continue like this. And if even the Financial Times this morning are now, focusing on what's been happening with NHS productivity falling back,
that's another issue.
We've got a real crisis in our NHS.
I'll come on to that in a moment. Let's just stick with what you are claiming. Is it Labour's policy is that you would institute a system where you'd get a GP appointment within 48 hours? Is that correct?
That's right.
Right. Which the Royal College of GPs has said is, quote, ill thought out and a knee-jerk policy, which the BMA says is an irrelevance.
But
have you consulted any of these organisations?
Well, look, of course we're talking to them all the time, but actually it's patients who we really want to be listening to, and it's the needs of the patients. And ultimately, we've got to make sure that when people want and need to see a general practitioner, when they want to see their doctor, they're actually able to do it, rather than feeling as though they have to just, join the queue in A&E. A lot of people don't want to go to A&E. They know that they're experiencing difficulties there. What we don't actually want is people not going to either see their GP or the NA because they're trying to be responsible and
But
stay out of the
you're only
system.
putting 100 million towards this policy, correct?
Well, except actually when you look at what we're doing through the proposals we've got to raise money from properties of £2 million and above, that would actually also relieve pressure on the NHS through the 8,000 extra
Yes, but
doctors,
you've only
the
allocated,
20,000 extra
allocated
nurses.
100 million to this. Now, again, all these authorities, the Royal College, the BMA, say that's not enough. And a Treasury civil service study has said it would actually cost 1.4 billion.
Well,
So why can you do it on 100 million?
We dispute those figures, but look, you've got to look at all of the
What's wrong
different
with
ways.
the Treasury? What bit of the Treasury report on saying it would cost 1.4 billion is wrong?
Well, I don't think that when you look at data that's been given to Treasury civil servants from Conservative special advisors, you've got to take that with us.
So what bit is wrong in that calculation?
Because the assumptions that those Tory special advisors made about our policy were not correct.
Which
but
ones?
ultimately,
Which ones?
we fully costed our pledge on this, and also on getting those extra GPs and nurses in. And you know very well, and I'll repeat it again, if people don't believe us on it, we're happy to put those proposals in front of the Office for Budget Responsibility to independently certify and validate. That's always been our offer,
Of course.
to make sure that there is a proper independent process for
You
looking at
created
all
this
of the
problem,
costs.
didn't you? I mean, you created this problem way back in 2004. You offered the GPs such a contract. It was so generous. You stuffed gold in their mouths and you allowed them to opt out of out-of-hours practice, and lo and behold, 90% of GPs did.
No,
this is trying to put right a problem you created back in 2004.
Look, the NHS has always faced challenges and changes, but what's been happening
What's
as
the
demand...
answer to my point that I just made, though? Not general waffle. What's the answer to my point?
It's not waffle. I disagree with you about what happened in 2004.
Well, you
What,
disagree that 90%
more than 10
of
years
doctors
ago,
pulled out of hours service?
I don't
You
agree
disagree with
you.
that?
If I can finish the point, I don't agree with you that something that happened 11 years ago has been causing the crisis in the last 2 or 3 years in particular. I think it's more related to the fact that they scrapped NHS Direct and instituted a 111 service that people have found very difficult to access and hasn't had the medical advice available. I think it's been caused also by the dropping of that 48-hour pledge for GP access, and of course that's driven people to A&Es.
Okay.
I think we do need more resources for the NHS, but when we say we will get those resources in, we'll say exactly where the money has come from, and at least you've got to credit us with it. We've made sure we say taking on what might be an unpopular thing for people in properties of over £2 million and above. We've asked them to chip in a little bit more to help our GPs and our NHS
We'll have a
system.
discussion another day on how much that will actually bring in, but we're running out of time. We'll have to hold that for another day. But Priti Patel, why has productivity in the NHS been so bad under your government?
Well, I think we're rebalancing the NHS. We're making sure that money goes into the front line. And we have now got rid of something like 7,000 managers in the NHS. And it's actually about taking the resources from the back and putting it into the front line.
So why is productivity, when you include hospitals, which I would suggest to you is the front line, averaging just 0.4% a year?
Well, don't forget, Andrew, we've seen over the last few years, we've taken the lid off some of our hospitals that haven't been performing well. And we've been making sure that we go in there and put the resources in there and support them where they need to improve them. Well, I think it takes time in the NHS. It really does. Nothing gets fixed overnight.
But you are dependent on continued productivity growth to meet the targets of the 30 billion extra that will be needed. 22 billion of that, you say, will come from productivity growth. You haven't delivered the productivity growth in this Parliament, so why would we trust you to deliver it in the next Parliament?
Because there are a number of factors here. One is increasing demand in the NHS. There's no doubt about that in terms of patients. The front line, if you look at winter, for example, we've had a very cold and challenging winter. So there's high demand there. So the pressures have been there.
It hasn't been inordinately cold.
Well, that is today, Andrew. I
winter.
think that is today. But the reality...
No, it's everywhere.
But the reality
the temperatures have been rather mild. We have not had a seriously cold winter overall. Parts of the country have been cold. Actually, parts of the country where most people don't live. It hasn't been a cold
Andrew,
winter.
there are always
and yet
challenges and
average
pressures.
productivity is very, very low, and you've not increased it. Can I put the Chief Executive of the King's Fund, which is the kind of IFS of health matters, he's described your reorganisation as disastrous and it distracted from patient care. You have increased enormously the cost of agency nurses. by huge sums of money, and that's why your productivity is on the floor. Why have you run our
look,
health service like this?
Well, no, I think if you look at actually, in terms of what we've inherited in certain hospitals as well, many of them were under PFI, going to foundation trust status. They had many, many structural problems in terms of their own governance and how they were run. We have had to put in additional money, which we've done, in terms of supporting the hospitals, the NHS, hospitals in particular, to make sure that there are less managers and more money is going to the front line.
In real terms, you've put in peanuts.
Actually, no.
But
it's
okay,
also,
how much have you put in real terms?
Well, recently we put in another $2 billion.
No, in real terms, how much have you increased the NHS budget?
We are committed to increasing the NHS budget.
In real terms, how much have you increased the NHS budget?
We have put in over 11 billion into the NHS.
No, that's money terms. I'm asking you, in real terms, how much have you increased the NHS budget?
It is a continual increase in the NHS.
By how much?
It is a constant increase into the NHS.
By how much?
And we also saw in December in the autumn statement we put in another $2 billion into the NHS.
No, that's money.
Well.
That's not real terms.
But that is cash that goes into frontline patient care, and that is what transforms the public's experience of the NHS as well.
All right. Well, we've got to leave it there. Chris Leslie, thanks for joining us. Priti Patel. Is Priti going now?
I think so.
OK.
Thank you.
You can get released.
It's good to know we know what's going on, isn't it?